Welcome to Our Hope, a production of Chosen People Ministries.
God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Genesis 1:27. Although we do not often think of motherhood this way, it is a very pronounced aspect of God's character. We tend to view God in light of his fatherhood, but the term motherhood captures some of the deepest parts of God. Here are just a few examples of God's protective nature: his tender, nurturing care, his sensitivity toward us, and a keen awareness of our needs. He even knows the numbers of hairs on our head, the strong bonds of intimacy he has and longs to have with us, his gentleness and his deep compassion, and even his overwhelming emotions toward us. Jesus captures this motherhood of God when he looks upon Jerusalem and freely expresses some powerful feelings, saying, "How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." Matthew 23:37. Mothers know their children better than they know themselves, just as God knows us better than we know ourselves. The relationship between a mother and child begins before birth. Just as God says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. The Bible talks about how God knew us, saw us, and loved us before he created us. We were set apart before birth. God knows us even better than a mother. He was the one who wove me in my mother's womb. Psalm chapter 139, verse 13. Perhaps mothers have a particular sensitivity to God's mysterious work during those 9 months, that it bonds them with their child in God-like fashion. In this way, motherhood reflects his image. But with such great love also comes considerable risk in this fallen world. Another character trait that God and mother share is the capacity for suffering of the deepest, most mysterious kind. Because the love of a mother is so great and deep, it runs the risk of pain that is just as deep. Every mother knows this. My wife and I know this well. We were expecting our first child back in October of 2019 when, suddenly after 9 months in the womb, our precious baby girl no longer had a heartbeat. We experienced 9 months of joy and expectation, but were met with pain, loss, and heartbreak. My wife was ready to be a mother to our daughter. That deep love she feels is as deep as the pain she continues to feel. I know my wife and I would do anything to undo that day. And because of this experience, we now see how God would do anything for his children, even laying down his own life. Today, we want you to meet 3 Jewish mothers. Their stories of great suffering led them to discover the deep love and comfort of God through the Messiah, who longed to gather them under his wings and who pursues his children with that gentle, loving, and forgiving spirit. As we hear these stories, remember that great suffering as a result of great love reflects God's own story, his deep, unfathomable pain because of his deep love for his children. Like the Israelites of Jesus' time, many Jewish people today expect the Messiah to be an influential political figure, a warrior, and a king. Monique, however, was always moved by Jesus' gentle care for the sick and the broken. The concern Jesus had for the powerless inspired Monique to pursue a successful law career, but her success made her forget how much she truly needed her Messiah. It was not until she had her first child that Monique learned to rest in her Messiah's care and relied on his strength. Listen to part of her story.
The thing that's always struck me about Jesus is like how down in the dirt he was in his life. You think about a Messiah who comes and we expect him to be this like big political figure, and he's gonna, defeat our enemies and he's gonna bring peace. And instead what the Messiah does is like get down in the dirt and heal people's broken bodies. He was always concerned like fundamentally with people who had no money and no power, and I was always inspired by his example. I was also interested in pursuing justice. I was also interested in going after big bullies as a lawyer by practicing law on behalf of people who have no money, who have no power, who are in situations where they're being abused. That's what I can do. I went to Thailand and got drawn to an organization that was working on the human trafficking issue. So I was working with these social workers and investigators who were looking into cases of human trafficking. So what I ended up doing for months and months was just like sitting in a dark room looking at this like revolting footage of children being sold for sex in brothels to bring some measure of justice to the situation. I was just amazed to find that like this was something that I had a capacity for, and it was something that would get me out of bed in the morning, and it was something that, it was something meaningful. When your life is going really well and like you're making lots of money and your career is flying high and you're in a great relationship and everything's good, like you don't need God. What do you need God for? Like, oh, I did all that. Like, I'm so smart and special, I did it. That's kind of the attitude that I had developed. I was so excited to be a mom, and I hated being pregnant, and I wanted him out of me. Got to the hospital, everything seemed to be going fine, and I turned over and like started to fall asleep. And the next thing I knew, the room was filling up with nurses. They're coming in and like stabbing me in the thighs and trying to get my son's heart rate back up because his heart had stopped. And I started shaking from the medicine that they were giving me, and they're taking apart the bed and they're shoving me down the hall. Within like 15 seconds, somebody hit a button on the wall and I heard on the intercom, code C. What just happened? Looking up at the technician who had this like put this mask on my face, and I said, please just save my baby. Please just save my baby. Boom, I was out. And then the next moment I wake up and they're like, congratulations, you're a mom. I see his little hands, reaching out of the little plastic, crib, and I didn't even see his face, and I fell in love with him. And then immediately they start telling me everything that's wrong with him. Someone said the word genetic disorder. And so the next week, recovering from a C-section, separated from my baby, wondering if he was gonna be okay, feeling just completely useless. And a nurse came in probably 2 days after he was born, and she was just coming in to like take my temperature and blood pressure, and she's like, how are you? And I just like burst into tears. She said, it's gonna be okay. I said, I don't think it's gonna be okay. I think something's really wrong with him. And I felt, I was at one of the darkest moments of my life. I felt so helpless, and I cried out to God, and I was like, God, what are you doing? Why did this happen to me? Where are you? I just had the feeling of almost like someone putting their hand on my shoulder. Just like this comforting, like, I'm here. Like, this sucks, and it hurts, and I'm here. I remember going to see him in the NICU, and he's in this little incubator, and he had all these like wires and sensors, and he had an IV in his arm, and he was like tiny and gray and shriveled. looked like a wrinkly old man, and it was like seeing him breathe, I could see his chest move, and I felt so helpless. Before I had my son, I kind of thought of myself as like a Wonder Woman. Like, oh, there's nothing I can't do, women rock, like everything is just a challenge, an obstacle to be overcome. And when I had my son, I realized like, I'm not in control. I'm not in control of my body. I'm not in control of what's happening with my child. This is all an illusion that I have control over really like anything. Like fundamentally, like I'm gonna have to depend on God. I literally, like, God gave me this child, and he came out of me, and I like had to give him right back and be like, here you go, keep him alive because I can't. You realize like I literally can't even get it from 1 minute to the next without God's help. 5 days later, I got to leave the hospital with him like in my arms and put this tiny little person in the car seat and, and go home. Thank God everything actually turned out to be okay. Every little issue that my son had, it all cleared up, in the space of that week. I have felt in times of immense sorrow and struggle and suffering, God was there. When people are going through the most horrific trauma in their lives, God is there.
Jesus set an example in caring for the broken, the sick, and the voiceless. In our day, many jobs have those responsibilities, including nurses, doctors, lawyers, social workers, and human trafficking activists. Mothers occupy many of these roles. The women in these roles reflect the sensitivity and care exhibited by the Messiah. Frequently, children are the driving force behind a mother's major decision. Ayla went back to school to learn all about her 5-year-old son's new diagnosis of Asperger's. Her search for answers as a special education teacher led her to discover the truth about the greatest taboo in her circles, Yeshua.
When I was 9 years old, we moved to the United States from Jerusalem. And the #1 song in the country was Anne Marie, One Day at a Time, Sweet Jesus. And I'll never forget, my mom comes into the car and I'm like, one day at a time, sweet Jesus. My mom says, what did you say, my mouth? And I said, I'm singing the song. She's like, lo omrim Jesus, we don't say Jesus. But why? In Hebrew, she says, ze Yeshua. I grew up not being able to say that name. My son, at the age of 5, was diagnosed with Asperger's. He was not verbal. He was very distant. He was the cause of me going back to school and becoming a special education teacher. I knew a lot about science. I studied a lot about everything, but I really never even opened the Bible. Ironically, I was teaching Hebrew school as a side job, teaching the prayers, teaching the liturgy. I mean, I knew everything. I had seen my father pray the prayers and put on the talid, and I know all of the rhetoric and everything that, goes along with being Jewish, but I didn't feel any connection to God. I would sit at synagogue and I tried to feel something. I tried to feel God. And it was like the Chagall stained glass windows and everybody around me and the Bima and the Ark and the Torah being taken out. And I remember feeling nothing. At my school, I worked at an after-school program, and there was a woman that had written a book called Jesus, Can I Talk to You? So she said to me, I don't have money to hire an editor. Would you help me edit my book? And I said, well, I don't know anything about Jesus. So I do know about writing, I know about English, I know about commas, I know about semicolons. I just don't know anything about Jesus. It was a lot of stuff from the Old Testament. And I'm like, and I would see things like, this is from Ecclesiastes, or this is from, Samuel or Kings. And I was like, these are our books. This came from the Jewish Bible. I never read the Bible. I read about the fact that he would be pierced. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus. And For the first time, the Bible came alive to me, and it's Isaiah 53. And, I said, how can you miss this? It's like right there. It's right there in the scripture. In our book, saying the prayer and asking for him to come into my life. And I accepted him as my savior, even though I just became a believer in the Jewish Messiah, but in Jesus, whose name I can't even say at the private Jewish school. Whoa, this is too weird. The grandson of the head of our Judaics program. And the first year that he was there, he, would talk to me and I would say, oh, it's time to go to tefillah. Students were required to go to prayer and you must go to tefillah. He's like, I hate tefillah. I'm like, your grandfather is the head of the Judaics program of the school. And so he comes up and he puts a kippah on my head and he's like, you're like a rabbi. Because rabbi in Hebrew means teacher. He goes, I could just see it. One day you're going to become a Hasidic. And I said, no, Joshua. Totally the furthest thing I'm going to become. He says to me, he goes, I don't understand you. What kind, do you keep Shabbat? What kind of a Jew are you? What do you mean, what kind of a Jew am I? And he goes, there's something different about you. I don't know what it is. There's something different about you. And I said, Joshua, sit down. I really respect you. And I'm going to tell you, what's different about me is that I believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And his eyes got wide and he stood up and he pointed at me. He's like, I knew it. You're always talking about love and stuff. And the students know. They know I can talk about God all day. See, I couldn't do that in public school. Public school, you can't talk about God. But at a private Jewish school, I could talk about God all day. And sometimes they'll go, they test me and sometimes I get really close and they really question, like, what am I really saying? But if they ever come to me and say, what do you really believe, like Joshua does or did, I would tell them, I believe that Jesus is my Messiah. Coming out of the Messianic closet, that's pretty much a good way to put this. I've gone completely against the grain. When you go against the grain, you get splinters. It's not easy. It's not been an easy path for me, especially knowing what I know and hearing what I hear, how the rabbis talk about him, how the students mock him. And I say, okay, I'm here for you. I want to stay here, And people ask me, aren't you afraid if they find out at your school that you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that you'll get fired? And I'm like, so? God will always provide. He has through everything, and he always delivers. He took it on the cross for me. Jesus died so that I could be born again. The greatest pain is to give up your own child. How much God must have loved us to give up his only son for us.
Like Monique, Ayla found that her greatest peace came from serving Yeshua and following his lead in her life. In many ways, she is now a spiritual mother at the Hebrew school where she teaches, guiding her students toward Messiah through her actions. Unfortunately, that spiritual nurturing mother figure was sorely missing from Deborah's life. But while her family upbringing was very turbulent and tense, Deborah was touched by Jesus' gentle, forgiving treatment of women and children and discovered God's desires and vision for family, love, and motherhood. This experience would redeem her past and change her future.
The reason I came to that place in my life, I was very disillusioned, I think, from growing up in a home that on the outside looked really, really good. We lived in a nice house in a really nice neighborhood and had everything we needed materially. And yet behind closed doors, it was very, very shallow and vacant and left me with a feeling of insecurity. And I was just determined to prove there was a better way to live. I was raised in New York City into a Jewish family We attended synagogue on the High Holy Days. I had family members that attended synagogue every Friday, every Shabbat. And in my home, even though we celebrated the holidays, it was really more an understanding that the stories behind the holidays were fairy tales. And the thing that really did make a difference in my life is my mom taught me a prayer when I was a toddler. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray thee, Lord, my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray thee, Lord, my soul to take. And when my mom taught me that prayer as a little girl, I really knew there was a God. And that stayed with me, and it carried me all through my childhood, my teenage years. I knew that when I prayed that prayer, that there was a God up there that heard me. My mom and dad loved me very, very much. I always knew that. But I was also raised in a home where there was a lot of tension. From the time I was a little girl, I lived with the threat of divorce hanging over my head. Sometimes my parents didn't talk to each other for days, and I was the messenger between them. There were a lot of fractured relationships. My mother and my grandmother hated each other. My mother and my brother didn't like each other. And I grew up with that just a feeling of insecurity. By the time I got into college, I was a very, very angry, rebellious young woman. I did dropped LSD, smoked pot. I lied a lot of times to cover up my wrongdoing, keep from getting caught. And I loved to shock people by the way that I looked, the way that I dressed. I loved the attention. So even at 19 years old and in college, I was still praying that prayer that my mom taught me as a toddler. And that led me to really, really search to find out who is this God. And that took me down the road of learning about Hinduism, Buddhism, transcendental meditation. I worshiped a guru in India. I chanted, and just searching in all of these places. And it was about that time in my life that I met Michael, also Jewish. And we had a talk one day and talked about our hopes, our dreams, our fears, our thoughts about God. And we were just amazed at the end of this 3-hour conversation that we were so alike. And we both knew after that one talk that we were soulmates, kindred spirits. Well, a month later, Michael came to me and he told me that he believed in Jesus. And I was devastated because I thought, oh my gosh, a Jesus freak, this is no good. I mean, after all, I was raised in a home where Jesus was never mentioned. In fact, if we said his name, it was like saying the worst profanity, and we'd get our mouth washed out with soap. I was raised in a home where, my mom was taught when she was a child that it was all Jesus's fault that Jews had been murdered and persecuted throughout the ages, and that Hitler was a Christian. And this was just horrible news for me because I knew I couldn't embrace what he did. I couldn't deny the change that I had seen in Michael's life just in this one short month, but I was not at all interested in hearing what he had to say about Jesus. But then one day he came to me and he said, Deb, would you mind if I just read something aloud to you from the New Testament? And I thought, okay. Now you got to understand, here I was 20 years old, raised in New York City, and never once had I heard or read anything from the New Testament in my whole life. And I had no idea that Jesus was Jewish. I had no idea that he claimed to be the Messiah that my Jewish people were waiting for all of these years. In fact, I thought Jesus was Catholic. I grew up near a Catholic church, and there he was on a cross, and I thought he was Catholic. But I said, sure, you can read to me aloud. So he opened up to the John chapter 8, the story of the Pharisees bringing the adulterous woman to Jesus. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in his midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now, in the law of Moses, it commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say? And as he's reading this to me, I was sitting on the edge of my seat. I had no idea how this story was going to end. And as they were saying this, testing him, in order that they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. When Michael read that line to me that Jesus spoke, something in me opened up and I just started to weep. Now, I had read about Buddha and Krishna and all of these other gods out there, but when he spoke these words of Jesus, I knew it was a miracle. It was like God opened my eyes and I saw that this Jesus was different than all the other gods that I had learned about, that this had to be the very, very words of God. In that one verse, all the love and the compassion and the mercy of God was encapsulated in that, and I just started to cry. So though my eyes were open, I immediately was filled with tremendous conflict. How could I, as a Jew, embrace this Jesus? And I remember just closing my eyes and praying and saying, God, if Jesus really is the Messiah, you are really going to have to prove it to me, because I knew the stakes for me were going to be very, very high. And though I'd been angry and rebellious, there was still a part of me. I did not want to devastate my parents and my whole family. And I knew that God really, really had to prove to me that I was going down the right path. So the very next day, I was invited to this meeting, and sitting in front of me was a little boy, about 5 years old, with his mom. And the man leading the meeting asked if anyone needed prayer. And the mom raised her hand, and she said her little boy was deaf in his right ear. So the man came up to this little boy and laid his hand on his ear and just simply prayed for healing in the name of Jesus for this little boy to get his hearing. And right there in front of my very eyes, I saw this little boy get his hearing. And when I saw that, and that it was done in the name of Jesus, that's all I needed. Well, a week later, I got up the courage to call my mom to tell her the news that I believed in Jesus. And it was a difficult conversation. My mom was devastated. She was furious and really, really disappointed in me, and very, very much hated Michael, because she knew that even though he was Jewish, he was the one that was responsible for introducing me to Jesus. Well, 3 months later, Michael and I were married, and sadly, our parents would not attend our wedding because we had a pastor marry us. But shortly after we got married, we were living on the other side of the country, and shortly after we got married, I called my mom, and I wanted to encourage her because I was so happy. And I called to tell her how wonderful Michael was, how he was loving me, he was treating me like a princess, in hopes that it would make her feel better. And instead, she said something like, why don't you just divorce him and come back home and live with me? And when she said that to me, I was so angry at her, I just slammed the phone down. And I went to Michael, and I was so angry, I was shaking. And I said, do you know what my mom just said to me? She hates you, she hates our marriage, I don't want her in our lives, she's not good for us, I don't want anything to do with her anymore. She hates you, and she hates our marriage. And he listened to me, and he said, Deb, you call your mom back and you apologize for hanging up. We are going to love your mom. We are going to love her. Now you call her and apologize. Well, God had a big cleanup job to do with us. We were, being two drug-using hippies, and he taught us how to be responsible, which was no easy task for two very irresponsible hippies. And over the years, we had 2 children, and our children are now married and serving God, and we have grandchildren who we adore. And the best part about this story, is that my mom, who at one time, years ago, hated Michael, now Michael is probably, next to my son, is her most favorite man walking on the face of the earth. And I know that it's a result of the years of just loving her very, very much, and God has blessed that.
All mothers will testify that motherhood is hard, but it is also incredibly rewarding. Motherhood is beautiful because it means connecting with some of the deepest parts of God, who is our lover and redeemer. So husbands and children, bless your wives and mothers, not just on Mother's Day, but every day, by reminding them that they are living out some of the most profound, most mysterious aspects of God's beautiful image. To all the mothers who are listening, including those who are holding their children in their hearts, we would like to wish you a happy Mother's Day. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Our Hope. This episode was made possible thanks to Dr. Mitch Glazer, Nicole Vaca, Grace Sui, Elizabeth Karp, Kyron Bautista, Neil Saraski, iFoundShalom.com in partnership with One for Israel. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Our Hope. If you like our show and want to know more, check out ourhopepodcast.com or chosenpeople.com. See you next time.